Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. You can follow the show on X at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. Over the course of this podcast series, we've looked at how various influencers are used in election campaigns to support a particular candidate, party, or cause. And we're going to keep doing that as the 2024 election unfolds. But in this episode, we're going to be focusing on how influencers, and in particular women influencers, can push a more meta-political agenda, meaning not so much focused on a particular candidate or a party, but more at an ideological level, trying to change broader moral, social, and cultural values. And my guest to discuss this is Dr. Eviane Leidig. She is a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow in cultural studies at Tilburg University, and last year published the book, The Women of the Far Right: Social Media Influencers and Online Radicalization, published by Columbia University Press. And so we'll dive into that book in this episode, and in particular, Dr. Leidig's digital ethnographic research following about a dozen prominent women influencers that were associated with the alt-right movement around the time of Donald Trump's presidency. And even if you follow American politics closely, these are influencers that you may not be particularly familiar with. People like Lana Lochtef, Lauren Chen, and Robin Riley. And while you may have heard of Milo Yiannopoulos or Steven Crowder or Ben Shapiro, these are sort of the women counterpart of that far-right movement. And what Dr. Leidig did is immerse herself in the various presences that these influencers had on platforms like YouTube and Instagram to find out what was going on there in terms of how these influencers were creating intimacy and relationships with their audiences. And to me, what sticks out with these women influencers is that different from their male counterparts, they really work in more lifestyle content around things that we associate with the trad wife movement, for example. So the sort of domestic labor around cooking and parenting sort of blends in with moral and political values in a way that is unique to these women influencers. And so we'll dive into that in this episode, and in particular, how mainstream platforms like YouTube and Instagram, through this type of women-focused lifestyle content, can carry these very imbued messages around cultural, moral, and political values. So a fascinating study, a fascinating topic. And without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Eviane Leidig. Again, she is a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow in cultural studies at Tilburg University. Dr. Leidig, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So before we dive into the social media strategies of these influencers, why don't we start out with a bit of background context to your research project? You set out to study far-right women influencers for 3 years at the height of the alt-right movement, which you stress is a movement within a broader far-right ideology. So could you describe this distinction for us between alt-right and far-right, and how social media was particularly important for the alt-right to emerge?
Yeah, so I started writing this book in 2019 around the decline of the so-called alt-right. So for context, when I think about the alt-right and the way that I situate it within the book is I attribute it to a specific time and place. So for me, the alt-right was at that moment in time the most contemporary manifestation of far-right politics in North America, which really started around 2015, 2016, and then kind of fizzled out by the end of Trump's presidency. It was a movement that really surfaced through online technologies. So when I write about the emergence of the alt-right, I say that it's also a story just as much as trying to understand the rapid rise of social media use. So it was a arguably leaderless movement. There wasn't a very clear ideology, although if you look closely at what some of the primary ideas were within the alt-right, it derived from what is the legacy of far-right ideology, namely nativism, authoritarianism, and populism. And it was a movement that did tend to fracture out of North America. We definitely saw some connections transatlantically to the UK and Europe, and some would argue to Australia. But I think it's really important to situate it as a specific time and place. Now, when I first started off writing this book, I had decided to just call this a book about the alt-right. And then some colleagues in this space who I was discussing the book idea with, they were like, well, it actually is just about the far right. But what you're looking at is just a very specific, narrower lens of the far right.
Right. And you describe the agenda of these influencers as meta-political, meaning that they aim to change social and cultural values. So could you outline this argument about their agenda being meta-political? But then what about formal politics? Did they get behind certain candidates and parties? I mean, this was around the time of Donald Trump, but was there support for formal politics also evident in their content?
That's a great question. And I think this is something that perhaps was an early indicator when I started looking into the alt-right as a movement, which was, yes, indeed, it could sort of coalesce with the rise of the Trump election and presidency. So obviously there was a vested interest in terms of what was happening within the GOP. But my main argument within the book, and perhaps what has allowed for the alt-right to sort of linger as a movement, was this very strong focus on metapolitical activism. So by that, I mean that these influencers, as well as sort of other alt-right political activists, they weren't so concerned about getting votes at the ballot box. Yes, it was important that Trump got elected, but for these activists, they were much more concerned about a long-term political strategy. By that, I mean that they were really focused on trying to shape public consciousness around certain social and cultural issues, whether that be things like anti-feminism and traditional gender roles, or more broadly, things like anti-immigration politics, anti-Islam, anti-Semitic ideas, these sorts of attitudes that they were really trying to help push at a cultural and social level. So indeed, they were still very politically oriented, but perhaps politics with a lowercase p.
And would you say that that metapolitical agenda is something specific to the alt-right, or is that something also that captures the far right as well? Because I think perhaps the far right does have a bit more connection to formal party politics than at least what I think of when I think of the alt-right.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about the far right, we have to remember it is a really broad spectrum, right? So it could be things like political parties, particularly in Europe, but also social movements, some cultural organizations. I mean, it's such a vast landscape. On the one hand, I think for many of these influencers, they were connected to actually established social movements, organizations. So I write in the book about how some of them are connected to the identitarian movements within Europe, which does try to sort of mobilize on issues towards the ballot box. Whereas, some are loosely connected to, say, the Republican Party in the US, but there are kind of more figures that you'll see operating within like the Turning Point milieu, or sort of trying to be more active in, say, like young conservative politics. But at least as far as I would assess them, they're not the people who I would see, say, running for political office or within parties, with the exception of maybe a couple of influencers I studied who are based in Europe, where it's a much more feasible option or avenue, I would say, towards impact with their activism.
Yeah, definitely. That's why the far right connotation kind of comes more from at least in my mind, from a formal politics angle, because of this European focus on multi-parties and the right wing of it. But could you give us a bit of an overview into the types of influencers you were actually following as kind of the personal manifestations of this movement? And in terms of the content or format that they were communicating, were there certain similarities across these influencers, or did they typically try to differentiate their content to try to carve out particular niches?
Yeah, so there's a select group of influencers that I first selected when I was thinking about, who I wanted to research for this book. Now, just bear in mind that when I started writing this book, when people thought about what the alt-right looked like, there was this very stereotypical image about, young, angry men. So I knew, for instance, that there were quite prominent women who were, say, influencers within this space, but they just didn't have as much attention, or they just weren't being taken as seriously as their male counterparts. So I started off by looking at Becca Lewis's report for Data and Society, in which she calls the Alternative Influence Network. So this was a network of what she calls reactionary right YouTubers. I would say that it was about the same as the alt-right in terms of what she had mapped out. And within that map, she identified a number of prominent women who were part of that alternative influence network. So that's sort of the core group of women that I had started off researching. So these are figures like Lauren Southern, Brittany Pettibone Zellner, Rebecca Hargraves, Lauren Chen, Lana Lochtef. So I started off with them. They had the most prominent YouTube followings. And then I kind of snowballed from there, getting a sense of who they would have on their channels to interview or to have YouTube collabs. Where else were they appearing within the sort of alt media landscape? As I was writing this book, also, there were a couple of new women who had sort of popped onto the scene who started to get very popular within this YouTube far-right ecosystem. So I decided to include them as well. In total, there's like about a dozen women that I ended up following. Some feature more prominently than others, but I sort of show how they're all kind of connected into this network. And most of them are based in North America, that is the US and Canada, but they also have connections to Europe, Australia, and South Africa. What is interesting is, at least for most of these women, when they sort of start off their political careers in this space, they do so as commentators on YouTube, so sort of reacting to current events or to political developments. But they also almost all focus on an opposition to feminism, which they use their gender as a form of authority and credibility. So because they are women and because they're speaking out against feminism, it is seen as a sort of legitimate avenue for them to foray into this political space and to get attention within this network. So definitely a lot of shared aspects around opposition to feminism, but then also opposition to immigration, especially Muslim immigration, as well as, for maybe those on the bit more of extreme end, explicit anti-Semitism, as well as over time, I've seen them delve into various conspiracy theories, right? So first it was a little bit of QAnon, then during the pandemic, it was a lot of conspiracy theories around masking, lockdowns, and then vaccinations, and sort of how they tie that all together with their far-right ideas and beliefs. But they also definitely try to differentiate their content in slightly different ways. So for instance, like I noticed during the pandemic, a couple of influencers were very drawn towards rallying around disinformation about the vaccines, and sort of tying that into conversations about health and wellness, as well as parenting and being mothers. So I definitely saw how they were starting to delve into what I would argue is various lifestyle content, in which they were starting to fuse their far-right political ideas into that lifestyle content.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I mean, I know that you were following these influencers across different platforms, and I want to get into those platform differences or similarities a bit more granularly in just a second. But you also mentioned how over the course of your research, some new influencers popped up. They're also collaborating with each other. And I'm just curious about how they would or not stake out particular issues. You mentioned at some point that, for example, Lana Lochtef was able to early on kind of make this bridge between the manosphere and women-supported misogyny. The way that I read it was that it's sort of staking out that issue. So do you think there was a type of issue ownership going on, whether that's for explicitly political issues or also carving out niches and, as you said, like health and lifestyle type of topics?
Yeah, I mean, so you're right in the sense that, for some of these influencers, I think to stand out, I mean, we have to remember that this space, it's very competitive. That is, there's always, influencers trying to solicit more attention from others, trying to get more followers, likes, etc. So there is an aspect of issue ownership. But I mean, despite that, I do think that there is quite a lot of convergence around certain ideas within the far right, namely things like traditional gender roles, anti-LGBTQ, anti-immigrant, anti-Islam, etc. I think where I actually started to see the most differentiation is how these influencers were trying to craft their own individual personas in communicating that message. So actually, the message is the same everywhere, but it's more like how are they trying to build a personal brand to be able to sell that message to their audiences. So indeed, it was stuff like communicating that through various avenues of lifestyle content. Maybe this one influencer was much more interested in topics like motherhood and parenting and cooking. Another influencer might be more interested in like things like documentaries or sort of traveling around the world and sort of giving speeches and connecting with other far-right activists in Europe. So I would say that for each influencer, it was more about trying to fit into what is the type of audience that I want to reach. And sometimes I would see them try various strategies to see if they could tap into new or to different audiences. So as I mentioned earlier, I remember a couple of influencers started spewing a lot of that QAnon rhetoric. And then I kind of noticed that they stopped doing that. And I wonder if they realized like, I'm not really soliciting a new audience by trying to diversify my content in this way. So I think they definitely, like most, apolitical influencers, they try different things to see sort of what lands and what sort of can generate the most visibility for them or new followers.
I mean, I think, as you said, this idea of it's a competitive market and what they're doing is tied to a sort of broader economy of attention. And I'm sure they are watching their platform stats to try different issues, try different things, and see what gains traction. And I want to come back to that idea of platform stats a little bit later. But let's talk about the actual platforms that you were looking at. And I know that you were monitoring multiple platforms, but a recurring theme throughout the book is that YouTube and Instagram appear as particularly important. So can you describe why these two platforms in particular stood out in your research?
So I definitely first focused on YouTube simply because it is like the OG home for the far right, and sort of for the alt-right in particular for these women and the network that they were connected to. It, in many ways, sort of gave rise to their political careers in this space. But then I had realized, over a bit of time, how they started to adopt Instagram more in their content creation. And this is a really striking gender difference between them and the men within the alt-right. So like the men in the alt-right, these far-right women, they were also political commentators on YouTube and reacting to current events or offering hot takes. But unlike their male counterparts, these far-right women were also posting on Instagram about the most banal daily aspects of their lives, right? Things like cooking dinner for their families or just very general household labor tasks. And so I was really struck by this difference. And I wanted to know, why were these far-right women choosing to showcase this aspect of their daily lives? And of course, I know that this is still a social media performance, right? They're still trying to cultivate this image or this brand of themselves. But they were trying at least to position this aura of authenticity in ways that their male counterparts simply did not. So that's sort of one reason why I kind of started shifting to including Instagram more in my research for this book. Not to mention Instagram is also like a very influencer dominated platform as well, right? Like there's certainly a lot of built-in affordances around things like monetization, partnering with various brands for corporate sponsorship, et cetera, right? So these are certainly genres and practices that these far-right women were very good at sort of exploiting in terms of taking things that were seen as apolitical and politicizing them for their audiences. I also noticed that there was a gender split in the sense that, from what I could tell, and at least based on the limited information I had, was that they tended to have a lot more male followers on YouTube versus a lot more female followers on Instagram. And I think part of it's because they were using these platforms in different ways to reach different audiences. So that was a really interesting, unexpected gender split that I saw between these two platforms. And finally, one thing that really led me to wanting to focus on YouTube and Instagram is because I was very interested in these visual dominated platforms, right? Like, yes, these women are also posting on Twitter, on Telegram to some extent, as well as some other alt tech platforms, but they thrive on YouTube and Instagram because they really play into, frankly, their looks within the attention economy of these platforms, and they're able to be quite successful on them.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on a couple of things you said there, but one in particular is this idea of, that those are kind of influencer dominated platforms. There's also their aesthetics as well. But you mentioned at some point in the book that TikTok is a platform that these influencers haven't really uptaken because I think there's a difference between this length of format that you can deliver on YouTube. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I mean, so to be fair, I did submit the book manuscript in September 2022. So, I mean, even after just like a year between when I submitted the final manuscript to actually when the book got published, there was definitely some new updates within just that year. I mean, it's crazy to think that TikTok really exploded since the pandemic, actually. I think, some of these women, they are on TikTok now, and they've actually gained a significantly larger followings compared to 3-4 years ago, I think, when the platform was still rather novice. But in general, I think most of them are known by their YouTube and Instagram profiles rather than TikTok. And also, well, I guess we'll see what happens with the ban in the US, right? If that's actually going to affect their TikTok following or not.
Yeah, to be determined, maybe by the time this episode is out. But I also wanted to ask you about something I found really interesting argument that you put forth, which is, I mean, when we think about these women influencers or influencers in general on the far right, the idea of alternative platforms comes up. A number of ones you mentioned in the book, Gab, Minds, Telegram, as you just said. But you make this argument that because of the mainstream aspect of YouTube and Instagram, that they're so kind of public facing platforms, that this gives them a sense of legitimacy to their far right message. And I'm wondering if you can go into that idea about I guess part of it's just the reputation of the platforms themselves as being so mainstream that it kind of interacts with the extremity of their ideology.
So yeah, that's a great point. And my key argument of the book is that far-right women are normalizing and legitimizing extreme ideas to mainstream audiences. So of course I look at this through the avenue of mainstream social media platforms like YouTube and Instagram. But I think one reason why that holds is a lot of men within the alt-right or the far right have been banned from most of the major social media platforms, right? So they've had to resort to alt-tech platforms. And alt-tech platforms certainly play a purpose in terms of sort of continuing to foster that in-group identity, trying to create pathways towards mobilization and sort of cementing those bonds that are so important for community building. But mainstream platforms are primarily aimed towards amplification and exposure towards mass audiences. And so these far-right women influencers, if they haven't been deplatformed from YouTube and Instagram, why would they leave if they have such large audiences, and that provides the best avenue for them to be able to reach that mass market that's necessary. And so I do think I look at this in a very strategic way in terms of, maybe it's not as coordinated as I think it is, but in my mind, I mean, for these far-right women, if they can continue to promote these much more extreme ideas into the mainstream, just why not continue to take advantage of those platforms? Now, I will say, like, at certain moments of time, I did notice that these women, they weren't totally deplatformed, but, one had faced suspension for a short period of time because she was actually showing photos of her husband's face, and he is banned from Meta's platforms. But, sometimes it was just the most minor things, like having a fact-checked label placed onto a piece of content. Sometimes it was like a flagging of a piece of content, right? So it was a very minor violations that they would receive for some of the content. But I mean, those are very, very minor violations for what is a massive amount of content that they've put out over these years.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about it now, and I can't believe that in 2024 one can ask this question. But it just occurred to me that Facebook isn't discussed much in terms of these influencers' strategy, which you would think, as one of the mainstream platforms, that would play some role. I'm wondering maybe if we are just past peak Facebook when it comes to the far right.
Well, we are definitely past peak Facebook, although to be argued, like there's quite a lot of boomers that are still on Facebook that are getting radicalized on Facebook. So, no, I think certainly for these women, especially like 2015, 2014, yeah, they were definitely using Facebook actively, but I think they've just realized like they have to move where their audience moves. And so if their audience is mostly millennial and Gen Z followers, it wouldn't make sense to continue to be as active on Facebook.
Definitely. Let's talk a little bit about the research process behind this, which you note in the book is a form of digital ethnography. And I'm curious if you could tell us about that process of how you actually follow these accounts day to day. I know you mentioned that you set up some accounts specifically for the research process, had to deal with ethics approval. So could you give us a little bit of a backstory to the nuts and bolts of the actual research design and follow through?
Yeah, so in short, it was messy. And the reason I say that is because I think, like most ethnographic work, it can get very messy. You sort of start off with an idea about what you want to look for, and then it just rapidly expands as soon as you sort of start getting into the realm of the research process. So I did create fake accounts, I mean, for obvious reasons in terms of the risk to my personal safety. I didn't want to use my own personal accounts to follow these women. So I did create fake accounts. I will say that I had initially posted some content on those fake accounts. Actually, some content from what I would argue is from my quote real life. And so kind of blurring that boundary about using photos from my real life onto my fake account. But I didn't keep up too much with the posting activity. I think it was just while I was setting up the sort of initial stage of those fake accounts. But in terms of the actual process, I mean, I did write most of this book during lockdown, during COVID lockdown. So I was probably spending an unhealthy amount of time on YouTube and Instagram every day. I was watching hours of YouTube videos. I was also constantly getting notifications on my Instagram account, in the evenings, on the weekends, on holidays, about like new posts as well as stories, right? So another thing is when I started writing this book, they were more regularly just posting on Instagram onto their feeds, but over time they started to use Instagram stories much more frequently. And it sort of, we can get into perhaps the logistics of why I think that is. But because Instagram stories disappears after 24 hours, I was constantly monitoring my phone every time I'd get alerted about a new story. And I think in terms of doing research like this, where the data can just disappear, whether that's like choosing to self-delete or whether that's actually built into the infrastructure of the platform. I mean, I was just constantly online and I was constantly documenting everything that they were producing, because I looked back and over the course of the 3 years that I was following these women, I noticed that, like, for example, some of their YouTube videos had been taken down or changed to private, and only if you had the hyperlink to that video could you actually get access to that video, right? So it was definitely a very immersive and consuming research process. And I will say that even to this day, I still have those fake accounts and I still occasionally check their platforms. And I'm not sure if it's necessarily because I've just gotten so used to that. It's been very ingrained to do so. But just, I think part of it's like, it's also hard to leave this space once you've been so immersed into it for such a significant period of time.
Yeah, and I'm curious. I just thought about this now, that I wonder if you can speak a bit to your reflections about what I would assume is a added benefit of studying these in real time. I mean, as you mentioned, on the one hand, there's the benefit that some of this content may be deleted, but I do think that there's probably a difference between immersing yourself in this content as it's happening to get all of the context with it, rather than, for example, just kind of going back in time and watching it all at once, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I have to say it's hard to create boundaries sometimes around that, right? Especially if you're constantly monitoring and tracking this activity, and like any update can happen at any point of time, right? So it's almost like investigative journalism, or probably the most similar to that. I mean, to be fair, like I did start writing this in 2019. And so at that point, there had already been quite a significant amount of content that had been produced. So I was kind of trying to go through that material, but then at the same time, also trying to track new material that was coming out, right? And trying to stay updated. And like I mentioned, I submitted the book manuscript in September 2022, and it wasn't published until September 2023. So a year had elapsed from that time. And even during that year, there was new updates to what was happening in these women's lives that just didn't make it into the book in the end. So I think part of it is it's being wary about trying to stay current and up to date, but then at the same time, sort of reminding yourself as a researcher that you're not a journalist, right? Ultimately, what's most important is that you take the information that you do have, and then you sort of look into it at a broader scope and think about, how can I analyze this and how can I find meaning within this type of data to sort of extrapolate that to the bigger picture.
Definitely. And I think part of this, this immersive experience is what can lead to radicalization, which is, I know, a topic that you've worked extensively on. And you mentioned in the book a few times about Instagram stories and that they have perhaps a potentially strong potential for radicalization. So I'm wondering, could you tell us a little bit about how these influencers were using stories? Because it's not something that we can often capture for the ephemeral nature of them, but also why you think that these might have some potential effects on radicalization processes.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, over the course of writing this book, I had noticed these influencers were using stories more frequently than they had when I had first started. And it sort of started off with what you might see in most Instagram stories, just very banal daily content, things like posting themselves like cooking dinner for their family or doing the laundry, or just I'd say very boring things actually. But I do argue that the reason why they post this is that it's a very intentional way of trying to establish a sense of relatability and accessibility with their followers. It's kind of what I say is both aspirational and inspirational content, because on the one hand, they're trying to project this image about what they think traditional family life looks like to their followers. So yes, it's them making sourdough bread, but it's also sometimes a bit more the mundane activities that you see in daily life. Now, the reason why I also note that there could be strong radicalization potential in a short format like stories is because these influencers would also over time, or rather once in a while, post something in stories which was a lot more explicitly political than they would in posts that would just end up in their feeds. So for example, in stories, it was where I would notice a lot more conspiracy thinking, things like the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, this idea that white people are being replaced by non-white people in Western countries as a deliberate orchestration by governments. They would also be posting, in particular during the pandemic, scientific disinformation about vaccines in combination with also these population replacement theories, disinformation about the medical establishment. So quite a plethora of really problematic content. But because stories do disappear after 24 hours, it's actually been shown that users are very unlikely to report stories to the platform, let alone actually have enough time to enforce moderation, if necessary, on that content. But also stories offer the potential to really encourage DMs, private messages. And so sometimes I would see these influencers then share screenshots of their followers' replies to stories. So we're really facilitating that in-group thinking of the content they would post. Other times it was trying to deliberately solicit engagement by things like Q&As. And so this is why I describe the potential for radicalization within stories is because as a format, it inherently encourages a more interactive relationship between influencer and follower.
Absolutely. And I think going back to this idea of kind of the attention economy, I think it is a way to encourage people to actually follow and, build the number of followers that one has to get this kind of more or less exclusive content that it would also make sense these influencers incentivize people to follow by giving them more and more extreme attitudes in this format versus archiving it on their channel.
And I will add that also, like, it was a way for them to test out ideas to audiences, right? To sort of see if maybe they could solicit attention or provoke something into their followers too, right? And it's a very safe way for them to test those ideas because it does disappear.
Interesting. And as you mentioned that they may use it to solicit more engagement or host Q&As, so some sort of level of interactivity with followers. I'm curious about the what's happening below the fold, so to speak, in terms of the commentary that would happen, especially on YouTube, because any type of content on social media, but particularly YouTube, I think, opens up this kind of space out of nowhere for people to discuss. And I know you mentioned seeing a lot of male commenters, which was surprising, but how did you approach these comments? And what did you find out by just kind of immersing yourself in these conversations as well?
Yeah, that's right. I didn't focus on commentators of these influencers, I think because part of it was just my time restriction. And I really wanted to show more the influencer side of broadcasting themselves to their followers. Although, interestingly, one of the reviews I had gotten on the manuscript did bring that up in terms of how it would be good to see sort of the extension of their influence on commentators, which I agree that would have been great, but I was restricted, as well as ethically, I was restricted in terms of my approval to conduct this project. But I think one way to extend this research would be indeed to look at the commentators. So my impression of commentary, especially when it came to YouTube live streams. So I did hop onto a couple of live streams. And what's interesting about live streams is also you can see the chat bar and live function as well, right? And speaking of the online attention economy, one thing that was really striking to me during these live streams is that these influencers would encourage those who donated during live streams by saying that they would take their questions at the top of the chat. So what happens is during a YouTube live stream, if you do make a donation, you get this special designation that shows that you have donated. And so your question appears at the top of the chat box. And so these influencers would encourage that by saying, we will prioritize those who have donated. And so speaking to the monetization feature of the platforms, that was something that I definitely saw them encourage from their audiences to help guide the subsequent conversations during the live streams. In terms of the gender split, I think on YouTube, my superficial takeaway from that is it's a lot of guys just sort of commenting on their looks and their attractiveness in the comments. So more about their physical appearance. Sometimes the comments are a bit more substantive, relating actually to ideas and to ideology. On Instagram, I see a lot more female commentators actually trying to engage in a more substantive way with their content creation, trying to share tips that they have as well for, say, being a new mother and breastfeeding, or other tips for cooking. So I definitely see it much more of a interactive relationship on Instagram than on YouTube. But I think part of that is because YouTube, it really frames itself as broadcasting yourself, right? Which is quite different from Instagram, where I think it's a lot more shaped around trying to at least create this perception of an interaction between influencer and follower.
Definitely. And my last question kind of ties into this in the sense that I got the impression from towards the end of the book, you're sort of talking about how these different influencers, they would, in some cases try to split their audiences into different accounts, one for parenting, one for politics, or they would sort of go off the grid and focus on their family life, but then they would seem to come back at some point, or they would try, Telegram or Gab or whatever, but then they'd seem to always kind of revert back to YouTube and Instagram. And so I'm just curious to get your thoughts on whether that is an accurate assessment, if that was the pattern. And if so, do you think that these influencers are sort of locked into a certain style of content, or maybe just pulled to the platforms for money? Because if they are, then it would seem that their sustainability is kind of tied to the platforms themselves rather than their particular personalities or ideas. So just curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. I would say I would generally agree with that. In a way, part of me feels like sometimes this book feels dated because I'm writing about a movement and a phenomenon which really was at its peak a few years back. And so sort of some of the practices and behaviors of these activists kind of feels locked in and within that certain style of content. But like I also said earlier, like if these women are continuing to thrive, continuing to get monetized on these platforms, what is the incentive for them to leave? And some have left and then come back and then left and then come back again, right? So I think there is something that draws them back into the spotlight, which is I think they simply enjoy being in that position of celebrity, for lack of a better word. I mean, I think they enjoy the attention. And I think, ironically, for a lot of these far-right women who preach against feminism, I think they could actually be the primary breadwinners of their families because of the amount of monetization that they actually receive on these mainstream platforms, as well as the fact that you can sort of choose to donate to them through other avenues like Bitcoin or PayPal, sort of traditional crowdsourced donations. But I think in terms of looking forward or looking to the future, some of these women are certainly not as active as they used to be. And I think that is a sign. And I don't know if that's necessarily because they have decided to shift the focus. So, I mean, for many of these women, they started out single, being in their 20s and being very active, traveling around the world. Now they're starting to have families and they're trying to settle down. So with that, the focus of their contents has shifted, but they're simply not as mobile, I would say, as they used to be. And certainly their resources and time has changed fundamentally too. That said, there are a couple of influencers who really started to pop up during the pandemic within this space that I have continued to track, and they are actually surging in popularity as well. So whether they will come to face the same types of obstacles or challenges as, say, the previous generation of far-right women have, I think it'll be really interesting to follow.
Yeah. And as you said, even though, I mean, this landscape is changing so fast that even though some things may seem locked in, I think it's important to have this capsule so that we can look to see how either the strategies or the relationship between these strategies and the platform environment interacts with this far-right movement over time. So Dr. Leidig, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your research with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Eviane Leidig, Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow in cultural studies at Tilburg University. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, we'll continue the focus on influencers with Ryan Davis, co-founder of People First, which is a platform connecting influencers with political campaigns for the American left. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Alma. See you next time.